The Hartwell estate stood like a beacon against the dark November sky, its warm, golden lights spilling out onto the sprawling, frost-covered lawns. The house, a towering masterpiece of old-money opulence, was adorned with tasteful autumn decor, garlands of orange and red leaves twined around its grand pillars, and carved pumpkins dotted the stone pathway leading to the main entrance. The scent of roasted turkey and spiced cider wafted through the air, mingling with the crisp chill of the evening. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, almost intoxicatingly so. The Hartwell family was hosting their annual Thanksgiving dinner, a long-standing tradition that brought together not just immediate relatives, but extended family, close friends, and even a few influential acquaintances. Victor Hartwell, the family patriarch, prided himself on these gatherings, often boasting that they were as much about showcasing the family's unity as they were about giving thanks. The grand dining room was a picture of abundance. A massive oak table, polished to a mirror-like sheen, was laden with every conceivable dish: golden brown turkey, buttery mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pies of every variety, their flaky crusts glistening in the candlelight. Crystal glasses sparkled alongside fine china, each place setting meticulously arranged by the staff. A roaring fire crackled in the ornate stone fireplace, casting a flickering glow on the gilded frames of family portraits that adorned the walls. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the room, creating a symphony of holiday cheer. The Hartwell family members moved among their guests, smiling and toasting as though the very air was imbued with prosperity and goodwill. Victor, a man in his late 60s with an air of commanding authority, stood at the head of the table, a glass of fine bourbon in hand. His wife, Madeline, radiated elegance in her emerald green dress, her every move calculated to exude grace and sophistication. To the outside world, the Hartwells were the epitome of success and harmony. Victor was a celebrated businessman and philanthropist, known for his charitable contributions to the community. Madeline played the perfect socialite, hosting charity galas and fundraisers with aplomb. Their children, Elliot and Vivian, were ambitious and attractive, the kind of heirs who seemed destined to carry the family legacy forward without a hitch. Yet beneath the polished surface, the Hartwell family harbored secrets, resentments and rivalries that simmered just out of sight. Victor's domineering nature had strained his relationships with his children. Elliot, the eldest, struggled to live up to his father's towering expectations, while Vivian, the younger sibling, had long been at odds with Victor over her rejection of the family's traditional values. Madeline's serene demeanor masked years of quiet discontent, and the extended family, though smiling politely, nursed grudges of their own. Even among the friends and guests, whispers of envy and hidden agendas lingered in the air like an unseen fog. As the evening unfolded, the cracks in the Hartwell family's facade became more apparent to the perceptive eye. There were sharp glances exchanged over the table, conversations that veered dangerously close to heated arguments before being smoothed over with forced laughter. Madeline's smile seemed just a little too tight, and Victor's booming laugh carried a note of condescension that made some of the guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was subtle but undeniable, a thread of discord woven through the festive tableau. After dinner, as the guests mingled in the grand living room over coffee and brandy, Victor excused himself, announcing that he had some important business to attend to in his study. It was a familiar refrain. Victor often retreated to his sanctuary after dinner, leaving the socializing to his wife. No one thought much of it as he disappeared down the hall, the heavy door to his study closing with a definitive thud. The evening continued, the lively chatter gradually giving way to the soft murmur of smaller conversations. But then, just as the first guest began to consider leaving, a scream pierced the air. It came from Victor's study, sending a jolt of alarm through the room. The guests rushed toward the source of the sound, their footsteps echoing ominously in the silent corridor. It was Madeline who found him, her hand flying to her mouth in horror as she pushed open the door. Victor Hartwell was slumped over his mahogany desk, his face pale and lifeless. A carving knife, one that had been missing from the Thanksgiving table, was embedded in his back, its gleaming blade catching the light from the desk lamp. Chaos erupted. Some screamed, others froze in shock, while a few guests instinctively backed away from the grisly scene. The realization that Victor had been murdered spread like wildfire, sparking panic and suspicion among the gathered crowd. Whispers turned to accusations as fear took hold. Someone in this very house had committed the unthinkable. The once warm atmosphere of the Hartwell estate was now thick with dread, the joy of Thanksgiving replaced by a chilling sense of betrayal. As the guests gathered in the living room, their faces pale and drawn, it became clear that no one could leave. The killer was among them, and until the mystery was solved, the Hartwell estate was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. The grand gates of the Hartwell estate creaked open, their usual imposing elegance now shadowed by the gravity of tragedy. A black car rolled smoothly up the long cobblestone driveway, its polished surface gleaming faintly under the cold November moonlight. Out stepped Detective Lucifier, a figure who commanded attention without needing to demand it. His tailored black coat billowed slightly in the wind, the edges framing his sharp silhouette like the wings of a raven. Lucifier's reputation had arrived long before he did. Stories of his brilliance were whispered among both law enforcement and criminals. His uncanny ability to piece together the most fractured of puzzles, his instinct for seeing what others couldn't, and his unorthodox, almost theatrical approach to solving crimes. His arrival was both a source of hope and unease for those inside the mansion. He paused at the entrance of the estate, his piercing gaze sweeping over the Hartwell mansion. Though his expression betrayed nothing, his sharp eyes seemed to absorb every detail: the perfect symmetry of the windows, the carefully manicured hedges, the tasteful yet ostentatious autumn decor. He noted the faint tremble of candlelight through the large bay windows and the shadows of the gathered crowd within. Impressive, Lucifier murmured to himself, his voice a low, melodic rumble. Then, with a small, sardonic smile, he added, "Too impressive." The moment Lucifier stepped into the grand foyer, the room fell silent, save for the soft click of his polished boots against the marble floor. The Hartwell family and their guests stood clustered together, their earlier hysteria now subdued into a tense, watchful quiet. All eyes were on the detective, their expressions a mixture of fear, curiosity, and guarded hostility. Lucifier's presence was magnetic, but it was his eyes that unnerved them most. They seemed to strip away the gilded layers of the Hartwell estate, peeling back its grandeur to reveal the raw humanity and the lies beneath. He took a slow, deliberate moment to study the assembled group, his gaze lingering just long enough on each person to make them shift uncomfortably. "Good evening," he began, his tone smooth, almost conversational. "I'm Detective Lucifier. I'll be investigating tonight's interruption to your holiday." His words were polite, but there was an edge of dry amusement in his voice, as though he found the contrast between the sumptuous setting and the grim reality of murder oddly ironic. He gestured toward the grand dining room behind them. "I trust you all had a wonderful dinner before the unpleasantness?" No one answered. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Lucifier wasted no time. With a quick nod to his assistant, Maya, a sharp and capable young woman who had been shadowing him for years, he moved toward Victor Hartwell's study. The family hesitated to follow, as though they were afraid to see the scene again, but Lucifier didn't wait for them. The study was a room of masculine grandeur, its rich wood paneling and leather-bound books a testament to Victor's power and taste. Yet now it was a grotesque tableau. Victor's lifeless body slumped over his massive mahogany desk, the carving knife protruding from his back. The faint smell of coppery blood mixed with the lingering aroma of fine cigars. Lucifier circled the room with predatory grace, his hands tucked casually in his coat pockets. He observed everything: the half-empty glass of bourbon on the desk, the shattered crystal decanter on the floor, the slight smudge of blood on the corner of a paperweight. Nothing escaped his notice. Interesting, he muttered to himself, crouching by the chair. His eyes narrowed as he studied the position of Victor's body, the angle of the knife, and the splatter pattern of blood on the papers beneath him. "What do you see?" Maya asked, stepping into the room with a notebook in hand. Lucifier glanced over his shoulder, his lips curving into a faint smile. A man who died with unfinished business, and not just the kind on his desk. Returning to the main room, Lucifier addressed the gathered group. His voice, though calm, carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Before we begin," he said, "I must ask something of all of you. Put aside your pretenses. Whatever illusions you've been holding on to, whether it's perfection, loyalty, or innocence, leave them at the door. Because I will find the truth. The only question is how painful the process will be." His words were met with a ripple of discomfort. Madeline Hartwell, her face pale but composed, stepped forward. "Detective, I trust you'll handle this investigation with discretion," she said, her voice carefully measured. "The Hartwell family is well known in this community, and—" "Your reputation?" Lucifier interrupted, his eyebrows arching slightly. "Yes, I'm aware. A family as perfect as yours usually hides the darkest secrets. But don't worry, I'm very good at keeping secrets, Mrs. Hartwell. I just happen to be better at uncovering them." Madeline's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, retreating behind her icy mask. As Lucifier began his initial round of questioning, he noted the subtle dynamics within the group. Elliot Hartwell, the eldest son, stood stiffly by the fireplace, his jaw clenched as though he were physically holding back words. Vivian Hartwell, Victor's rebellious daughter, perched on the edge of a chaise lounge, her sharp eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. Samuel Hartwell, Victor's brother, lingered in the background, his expression unreadable. The guests and staff, each more nervous than the last, fidgeted under Lucifier's probing gaze. "Everyone here had a reason to be grateful to Victor Hartwell," Lucifier said, pacing slowly. "But gratitude often walks hand in hand with resentment. After all, gratitude reminds us of what we owe." He stopped in front of the dining table, where the carving set had been neatly replaced, now missing its centerpiece, the knife buried in Victor's back. Lucifier's voice dropped to a low murmur. "A knife missing from the Thanksgiving table. Poetic, isn't it? A symbol of family celebration turned into a weapon." Lucifier turned to face the room, his sharp gaze sweeping over them one last time. "Tonight," he said, "we'll uncover not just the identity of Victor Hartwell's killer, but the stories behind every mask in this room. Because the truth doesn't just reveal the murderer, it reveals everyone." With that, he gestured for Maya to begin taking names and statements. The family and guests exchanged uneasy glances, their carefully constructed facades beginning to crumble under the weight of Lucifier's presence. Outside, the November wind howled against the mansion's walls, as if the night itself were warning them of the storm to come. Detective Lucifier's voice carried a decisive weight as he addressed the gathered crowd in the grand living room of the Hartwell estate. "Until the truth is uncovered, no one leaves this house," he declared, his sharp gaze sweeping over the pale faces of the family and guests. "I'll need full cooperation, and I'll get it one way or another." The house, sprawling and opulent, became a carefully orchestrated stage for Lucifier's investigation. He divided the space into zones: the West Wing, which housed the family bedrooms, the East Wing, where the guest quarters and staff rooms were located, and the common areas, including the dining hall, living room, and Victor's study. Each zone was sealed off, monitored by officers, and meticulously searched for clues. With Maya's assistance, Lucifier moved through the house like a chess master plotting his moves, questioning each individual in turn. What began as a polite inquiry quickly turned into a relentless uncovering of hidden truths. The Hartwell family's seemingly impenetrable facade began to crumble, revealing cracks that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Madeline Hartwell sat in a high-backed chair in the drawing room, her emerald green dress now a stark contrast to the pallor of her face. She clutched a handkerchief tightly, dabbing at the corners of her eyes as Lucifier questioned her. "I don't understand why anyone would do this to Victor," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. But Lucifier was not so easily fooled. "Grief is a curious thing," Lucifier said, his tone soft yet probing. "It can be genuine or it can be performative. Tell me, Mrs. Hartwell, were you aware that Victor planned to amend his will?" Madeline's hand froze mid-dab. What are you implying?" Lucifier leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "He was cutting you out, wasn't he? Said something about extravagant habits? Care to elaborate?" Her carefully constructed composure faltered, her lips tightening. "Victor had his opinions," she admitted. "He thought my spending was excessive. But I loved my husband, detective, and I certainly didn't kill him over money." Lucifier didn't press further, but he filed her reaction away. The mask had slipped, and beneath it, he saw desperation. Elliot stood stiffly near the fireplace, his broad shoulders tense and his jaw clenched. The eldest son and presumed heir, he carried himself with the weight of expectations. But under Lucifier's scrutiny, his confidence seemed to waver. "You had a heated argument with your father recently, didn't you?" Lucifier asked, his voice calm but unrelenting. Elliot exhaled sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "We argued, yes. That's no secret. He was threatening to dissolve the family business, something I've dedicated my life to." "And what was his reason for such a drastic decision?" Lucifier pressed. Elliot hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He didn't think I had what it took to lead. He said I was reckless, that I didn't understand the value of hard work." Lucifier tilted his head, studying Elliot's reaction. "Reckless enough to kill him?" Elliot's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with anger. "I didn't kill my father. I wanted to prove him wrong, not this." Vivian, draped in a leather jacket over a crimson dress, lounged on a chaise in the library. Her posture was casual, but her eyes darted nervously as Lucifier questioned her. "You've been estranged from the family for years," Lucifier began. "Why come back now?" "Thanksgiving," Vivian replied with a shrug. "Family obligations, you know." Lucifier raised an eyebrow. "Family you're disowned from?" She stiffened but quickly recovered. Victor liked to make threats, detective. But he'd never follow through. He enjoyed the drama too much. "And yet," Lucifier said, his voice dropping, "you argued with him the day he died. Slammed doors, raised voices. What was it about?" Vivian's smirk faded. "He said I was a disappointment. That my career was a waste of time. I told him I didn't care what he thought." She hesitated, then added, "But I didn't kill him. I'm not that desperate for his approval." Samuel, the quiet uncle who had lingered on the edges of the gathering, was a man of few words. But under Lucifier's questioning, his long-held bitterness surfaced. "You and Victor didn't see eye to eye, did you?" Lucifier asked, pacing the room. Samuel shrugged, his expression neutral. "Brothers fight. It's nothing unusual." Lucifier stopped and turned to face him. "Your fights were about more than brotherly squabbles. Let's talk about the family assets. Victor controlled them all, didn't he?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He always thought he knew best. Never trusted anyone else to make decisions. Lucifier nodded slowly. And now that he's gone, those assets are up for grabs? Samuel's silence spoke louder than words. Dr. Green sat in a corner of the study, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her calm demeanor belied the tension in her eyes. "You were Victor's confidant," Lucifier said, circling her. "His psychiatrist. You knew his secrets." "I knew what he chose to share," she replied evenly. "And did he share anything incriminating?" Lucifier pressed. She hesitated for the first time, then said, "Victor was under a great deal of stress. Family conflicts, business troubles. He felt betrayed by those closest to him." "Betrayed by whom?" Lucifier asked. "That's confidential," she said firmly. But Lucifier knew she was hiding something. Marco stood in the kitchen, his arms crossed defensively. His fingerprints were on the knife, but he maintained his innocence. "I prepare the food. I set the table," Marco said, his voice tight. "I didn't kill anyone. And yet, your knife was the weapon," Lucifier pointed out. "Odd coincidence, isn't it?" Marco scowled. "Anyone could have taken it. The kitchen is open to the family and staff. Check the cameras." Lucifier filed that away. If Marco was guilty, he was unusually bold about proving otherwise. Lila, Elliot's fiancée, perched nervously on the edge of a velvet chair. Her hands twisted in her lap as Lucifier questioned her. "You're new to the family," Lucifier said. "Yet you stand to gain quite a bit from Victor's death, don't you?" Lila flushed. "That's not fair. I loved Elliot, not his money." Lucifier raised an eyebrow. "Victor wasn't fond of you, was he?" Lila's eyes darted away. "He didn't think I was good enough for Elliot. But I never. I didn't." Lucifier let her flustered denial hang in the air. By the time Lucifier finished his first round of questioning, the web of motives and secrets had begun to take shape. Victor Hartwell had been a man surrounded by resentment, betrayal, and ambition. Every person in the house had a reason to want him gone, but only one had acted on it. Lucifier leaned back in his chair, his sharp mind already piecing the puzzle together. "The truth," he murmured to himself, "is always hidden in plain sight. It's only a matter of time before someone slips." Detective Lucifier stood in the dimly lit study, the oppressive silence of the room broken only by the occasional crackle of the fireplace. The shattered remnants of a wine glass lay scattered on the polished floor, the faint stain of red wine seeping into the expensive rug like a ghostly trace of a confrontation. On Victor Hartwell's desk, amidst meticulously arranged papers, was a torn letter, a single piece of evidence that whispered of secrets too dangerous to stay hidden. Lucifier leaned over the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the torn letter's jagged edges. The incomplete words hinted at blackmail, phrases like, "if this gets out," and "final warning." He tapped his gloved finger against the desk surface, deep in thought. Someone had been desperate enough to confront Victor, and that desperation had boiled over into violence. As Lucifier questioned each suspect, the web of deceit became more entangled. He had an uncanny ability to disarm people, shifting effortlessly between charm and menace. His questions were sharp, but his delivery was almost casual, lulling his suspects into a false sense of security before striking with pinpoint accuracy. "Let's talk about the wine glass," he said to Madeline Hartwell, Victor's widow. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the pearls around her neck. "I don't know anything about that," she replied, her voice wavering. "Strange," Lucifier said, his tone light but his eyes cutting. "Your husband's favorite vintage was poured into that glass. Surely you'd know if someone shared a drink with him shortly before his death." Madeline stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't respond, but the flicker of fear in her eyes told Lucifier he had struck a nerve. Elliot Hartwell was next, his confident facade beginning to show cracks under Lucifier's relentless questioning. The detective circled him like a predator, watching every shift in his body language. "Your father was planning to dissolve the family business," Lucifier said, his voice low and deliberate. "That must have been frustrating for you?" Elliot's jaw tightened. "We argued, yes. But I didn't kill him." "Did you know about the torn letter?" Lucifier asked, tilting his head slightly. "It seems someone wanted to pressure your father. Perhaps to change his mind about something. It wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" Elliot's silence spoke volumes, but he eventually muttered, "I don't know anything about that letter." "Interesting," Lucifier said, stepping closer. "Because your father's study wasn't locked. You could have been in there at any time." The statement lingered in the air, making Elliot shift uncomfortably. Vivian Hartwell, the rebellious daughter, was no easier to pin down. She lounged carelessly in a chair, her arms crossed as if daring Lucifier to challenge her. "The torn letter," Lucifier began, "couldn't have anything to do with your return to the family, could it? Perhaps your father found a reason to reconsider disowning you." Vivian scoffed. "Victor didn't reconsider anything. He was stubborn to the grave." Lucifier's lips curved into a sly smile. "And yet, you were seen leaving the dining room shortly before the body was discovered. What were you doing?" Vivian's expression faltered for the briefest moment before she said, "I was outside. I needed air." "Air," Lucifier repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or time to compose yourself?" Lucifier moved between the suspects like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of tension. The Hartwell mansion, with its grand rooms and suffocating secrets, became a theater for his performance. He played on the family's egos, stoking their fears and rivalries, and subtly encouraged their distrust of one another. His unconventional methods unnerved everyone. He left long silences after asking questions, forcing his suspects to fill the void with their own nervous words. He examined their smallest gestures, a clenched fist, a trembling lip, a glance exchanged across the room. Every detail was a thread in the puzzle. As the evening wore on, the cracks in their stories grew wider. No one admitted to being in the study, yet too many details hinted otherwise. Madeline knew more about the wine glass than she let on. Elliot seemed intimately familiar with the torn letter, despite denying it. Vivian's timeline didn't quite add up. And lurking in the background, Samuel, the quiet uncle, watched it all with an unreadable expression. Lucifier didn't yet have all the answers, but he didn't need them, at least, not yet. His game was about pressure, about pushing his suspects until they revealed more than they intended. As Lucifier stood in the study once more, looking over the pieces of the puzzle, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The web of lies was tangled, yes, but every lie brought him closer to the truth. "This family," he murmured to Maya, who stood nearby with her notebook, "is a symphony of secrets. But the louder the music, the more they forget their mistakes." "And someone," he added, tapping the torn letter, "just hit the wrong note." Maya nodded, watching as Lucifier's mind worked through the intricate web. The stage was set, and the unraveling had only just begun. As the long, tense night stretched into its darkest hours, Detective Lucifier summoned everyone to the grand dining room. The room, once filled with laughter and the warm glow of Thanksgiving celebration, now felt like a courtroom. The soft flicker of candles cast shadows on the pale faces of the gathered family and guests, their exhaustion and anxiety palpable. The ornate chandelier above seemed almost to loom, its crystals refracting light like shards of broken truths. Lucifier, his coat draped over the back of a chair, stood at the head of the table, his piercing gaze scanning the room. His assistant, Maya, leaned against a corner of the room, her notebook closed but ready. The tension was suffocating as Lucifier began to speak, his tone measured, deliberate. "This family," Lucifier began, his voice low yet commanding, "is like a beautiful piece of crystal, polished to perfection on the outside, but filled with fractures waiting to shatter under the right pressure." He moved slowly along the table, stopping briefly behind each suspect as he recounted the motives and contradictions that had come to light. The Hartwells and their guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Lucifier and each other. "The grieving widow," Lucifier said, his voice dripping with irony. "You played the part well, Madeline. But grief doesn't mask desperation, does it? Victor's decision to cut you out of his will wasn't just a threat, it was a certainty. And that made you very, very dangerous. The ambitious son," he continued, pausing behind Elliot. "You wanted to prove yourself to your father, to wrest control of the family business and show him you were worthy. But Victor wasn't going to give you that chance, was he? Dissolving the company wasn't just a business decision, it was a statement." "The estranged daughter," Lucifier said, his tone softening just slightly. "Victor disowned you for following your dreams, yet here you are, back in the fold, just in time for his death. Coincidence? Perhaps. But your argument with him earlier that day tells a different story." Lucifier's gaze settled on the quiet uncle, seated in the corner. "And then there's you, Samuel. The overlooked sibling. The one who stood in Victor's shadow for decades, forced to watch as he controlled everything, dictated everything, while you got scraps. You had your reasons, didn't you?" The room was silent except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. Lucifier stepped into the center of the room, the weight of his presence drawing all eyes to him. Finally, Lucifier paused, his hands clasped behind his back. "The killer," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is not the person you think. In fact, they are someone you all trusted implicitly." He turned, his gaze locking onto Samuel Hartwell, who sat frozen in his chair. "It was you, wasn't it, Samuel?" The room erupted in a cacophony of disbelief. Madeline gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Elliot shook his head, muttering, "No, it can't be." Vivian's eyes widened, darting toward Samuel as if seeing him for the first time. Lucifier raised a hand, silencing the chaos. "The torn letter in Victor's desk was your desperate plea, wasn't it, Samuel? A final attempt to convince him not to sell the family estate, the one thing you cared about more than your pride." Samuel's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't deny it, but his silence was damning. Lucifier pressed on. "Victor refused, as we all know. And in that moment, years of resentment boiled over. You took the knife from the dining room and confronted him here, in this very study." Lucifier gestured toward the study's door, visible from the dining room. "When words failed, you snapped." But Lucifier wasn't finished. His voice sharpened as he stepped closer to the table. "But here's the real twist. Samuel didn't act alone." The room froze. The air seemed to thicken with shock as everyone's gaze shifted to Lucifier, waiting for the next bombshell. "All eyes on Madeline Hartwell, please," Lucifier said, turning toward the widow. Her composed exterior, already frayed, shattered completely. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Lucifier's smile was cold, almost triumphant. "You colluded with Samuel, didn't you, Madeline? He may have wielded the knife, but you orchestrated the plan. You distracted the guests, ensuring Samuel had the opportunity to strike. You even helped create the alibis, knowing your role as the grieving widow would shield you from suspicion." Madeline's face turned ashen. "That's absurd," she stammered, but her voice was weak, unconvincing. "Is it?" Lucifier countered. "Victor was planning to leave you with nothing. But with him gone, you'd retain your place as the matriarch of this family. Financial security, control, all the things Victor was about to strip away. He turned to Samuel, who was now visibly shaking. And you, Samuel? You thought you were doing this for the estate, for preserving the Hartwell legacy. But you were just as much a pawn in her game as Victor was. The room erupted again, this time with accusations and denials flying like shrapnel. Elliot turned on Madeline, shouting, "How could you?" Vivian stared at Samuel in horror, while the guests murmured among themselves, trying to process the shocking turn of events. Lucifier stood in the eye of the storm, unmoved by the chaos. He gestured to the waiting officers, who stepped forward to detain both Samuel and Madeline. As they were led away, Madeline's composure crumbled completely. "He forced my hand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Victor was a tyrant. He deserved." Her words were cut off as she was taken from the room. Samuel said nothing, his head bowed, his silence a final admission of guilt. As the remaining family members and guests sat in stunned silence, Lucifier addressed them one last time. This family was built on power, appearances, and secrets. And tonight, those secrets became a weapon. Let this be a lesson. No amount of wealth or pretense can hide the truth forever. With that, he turned and left the dining room, his coat billowing behind him. Maya followed, glancing back at the fractured family with a look of quiet pity. Outside, the cold November air greeted them, crisp and biting. Lucifier paused on the grand steps of the estate, gazing back at the mansion, now dimmed by the weight of betrayal. "It's always the quiet ones," he murmured, before stepping into the night, leaving the shattered Hartwell legacy behind. Hey, thanks for sticking around until the end. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with some who would love it, and of course, subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to turn on the notifications by clicking the bell, so you're always in the loop. See you next time.